Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Sheila Bergman, Executive Director of UCR ARTS. If you've never visited UCR ARTS before, we are the California Museum of Photography and the Culver Center of the Arts in downtown Riverside, California. We're closed right now, but look forward to welcoming everyone back to the museum on October 24th. We're so glad that you could join us today for Third Thursday Talks, which is a new monthly program where we feature artists, curators, performers, writers, activists, musicians, and more. Today, we're talking to Sara Trail, founder and director of the Social Justice Sewing Academy. Before we introduce Sara and talk about her many achievements, Lindsay has a few items to cover about how the program will work.
Yes, I'm Lindsay Hamill, and I'm the manager of school and volunteer docent programs. Before we get started, we at UCR Arts would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Gabrielino, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrana peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting places home to many Indigenous people from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. So we're so glad everyone could join us today, and we will have time for you to ask Sara questions toward the end of the hour. Please put any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll get to those. We'll get to as many as possible starting at 4:45. And I'll hand it over to Sheila to introduce Sara.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to Sara Trail, founder and director of the Social Justice Sewing Academy. Sara learned to sew at the young age of 4 and is now a successful author, sewing teacher, pattern and fabric designer, and founder and director of the Social Justice Sewing Academy. At age 13, she wrote a nationally published book, Sew with Sara, that teaches teens and tweens how to make objects for fun and profit. Sorry, my notes went away on me. At 15, she starred in a nationally published DVDs, Cool Stuff to Sew with Sara. Then she designed 2 fabric collections, Folk Art and Biology 101, a pattern collection with simplicity, designed with love by Sara. Her pattern collection features prom dresses, backpack patterns, hoodies and jackets, as well as aprons and tote bags. While attending UC Berkeley, Sara created a quilt in memory of Trayvon Martin, and her love for sewing and passion for social justice came together. After graduating from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education, she founded the Social Justice Sewing Academy to be a platform where youth create art that engages and educates communities. A few weeks ago, UCR Arts opened up an exhibition of work by the young artists that participated in the Social Justice Sewing Academy workshops. We have some of those images from the exhibition later on in the conversation, so you can see them up in the gallery. Although the Culver is not open quite yet, you can see the full exhibition in the F-Stop pedestrian gallery windows from the Main Street Promenade. You can even scan QR codes on the window to hear the artist statements and learn about these powerful works of textile art. And again, we are planning on reopening October the 24th. And we're really excited to announce that the SJSA is going to be running workshops for students in schools throughout Riverside County in the coming months. On that note, let's start the conversation. Again, welcome, Sara.
Thank you.
You know, how did you get started sewing, and what were the first projects that you can remember?
You know, I remember sitting on my grandma's lap. She had the antique treadle singer, so I'd kind of just be whether I was pushing the foot pedal or kind of guiding the fabric. And really, it was quilting. Quilting was, kind of where I started. And as I got older, I kind of deterred. Perhaps next slide. And I really deterred into like fashion design. I deterred into prom dresses and really just other things. I enjoyed sewing for the amount of creativity that you could have, to be able to wear it, to be able to create something and say, like, as much as, quilting is fun for middle schoolers, where am I going to bring a quilt with my friends? As opposed to clothing, where you could make and create something and like wear it to prom, wear it to homecoming, or wear it to school, on free dress Fridays.
That's great. Besides your grandmother, do you come from a lineage of people that made quilts and sewed and whether it was for use or for gifts, etc.?
Yeah, so I have a great great grandmother named Margaret Smart, who's a 13-year-old Ethiopian slave. And she was bought by a Confederate soldier who's 33. And through like rape and ownership, she had four of his kids. And so on the screen pictured is one of the quilts that she made that she had given, and it was passed down to my grandma, who gave it to me after I wrote that first book. But really, I think coming from like I'm, a representation of like sewing throughout, resistance of a pretty rough time period, through slavery, through rape. As you can see her on the left as she was older, and she's on the right in the middle, in the chair with a few of her kids, and et cetera, et cetera. But to kind of understand that like sewing for like particularly like my black family and like my black southern family, sewing so correlated to like slavery and cotton fields and sewing from scraps and not necessarily for the luxurious love that I was afforded, definitely put things in perspective and kept, sewing is like, wow, like this is very different. This isn't my ancestors' craft, although it might be the same form. Like I'm doing this, on a really, fluent socioeconomic level. And my parents are affording me this luxury. Whereas, my ancestors and grandparents and great grandparents, may have been doing it out of necessity and need. So that was definitely kind of conversations that I had as a young person on Sarah. Other people sewed because they had no choices and they had to make quilts to keep warm. And Sarah, you're buying $15 yard fabric, and whether you finish it or not, like I'd encourage you to. But really, I think like the perspective of privilege of my luxury and my access into sewing was something definitely that my mom kept me grounded in as a young kid.
Huh. That's really interesting to hear in terms of your history, your family's history, and sort of the what how sewing has become an act of empowerment as well for communities. It's interesting. When did the social activism become inspiration for your art? And was it a gradual awakening, or did a specific event spark your activism?
Definitely. It was definitely a specific event. It was February 26, 2012. That's the day that Trayvon Martin got murdered. And so, like prior to him being murdered, I created this quote like March, April, a few months after his murder. But really what struck home was I remember being in a sewing class with a bunch of quilting mentors and friends and, colleagues for the most part, although, maybe like 4 decades older than me. Or even 5. But really, it didn't really matter about age. These are people that I learned new techniques with. These were like mentors. These are like my sewing community, and I'll never forget being in a class, and just kind of saying like, oh, what happened this week? Everyone just kind of recapping. Sewing definitely lends itself to conversation, which is something that we enjoy in our SJSA workshops, which is something I enjoy when we go to sewing classes. I definitely appreciate the amount of learning, growth, conversation of just it's sewing is something that you can do while talking. So I definitely appreciate that classroom setting for that. But I'll never forget this class. A week after he was murdered, it was like a weekend class, and everyone's like, oh, what's happened new this week? Oh, my grandkid's first tooth came in. Like just chitter chatter, and I definitely appreciate the chitter chatter. I'll never forget like my anger, my rage, my frustration with the fact that Trayvon had been murdered in Florida. I remember kind of bringing that to the conversation, and I'll never forget. I mean, not only the dismissiveness, but really the lack of rage, the lack of concern that my quilting friends and mentors and colleagues kind of had regarding this young kid's death. And so I think for beyond death, explicit murder. Let's be explicit. But I think like bringing up like he got killed. What are we gonna do? Well, I'm gonna go to some protests in Oakland, and I remember like, oh well, did you know him? Well, that's unfortunate. Okay, back to sewing. And for me, it was more than just being unfortunate. It was like I was feeling motivation to do something that I was sensing that my classmate peers weren't. So that was kind of the moment where after going home and expressing my frustration, mom was like, well, Sarah, if you want to do something about it, stop spending all your time sewing, double wedding ring and flying geese quilts and go make something. And so I was like, okay, well then, was motivated. I saw one of his photos, and this was the first quilt that I made where, I wasn't using a pattern. I wasn't trying to make a pattern. I wasn't making this with the intention of teaching other people how to duplicate it, nor was I making this with the intent of like wanting it to be a commercialized piece. I'd say from like since I wrote my book to like I made Trayvon, most things that I'd make, I'd either send to Simplicity or like I'd just send to someone, hey, I just made this. And more often than not, they'd be like, okay, let's turn it into a quick class, or let's make a quick video, or like it was really much like most things that I make, they wanted me to teach other kids how to make also. So this was a quilt where it's like I wasn't making this so other kids could duplicate this quilt. I was thinking like this matters to me, let's make a quilt about it. And if other kids want to make art about what matters to them, let's also give them that opportunity. But unfortunately, this quilt was met with so much resistance. Like the Barnes and Noble like book signings and events that I'd have, regarding sewing and teaching kids how to sew, from the quilt shops to book signings to other small lectures for like the Girl Scouts of America troop. Most places that invited me to speak wanted me to bring the projects that really had no message, and it was based on the skill as opposed to a quilt that like I really kind of want to talk about the broader issue.
So you made this quilt, and then when was the first time that you were able to exhibit it and really stand up alongside of it and present your story?
Once I left the quilting world, I went to Chicago, I went to protests, I went to BSU events. I was at UC Berkeley, so I had a lot of opportunities in academia, but never in the art world. So there would be like, like just a symposium on like racial justice. I'd reach out to the organizers, be like, hey, I made this quilt, and they'd allow, the quilt to be displayed at a non-art exhibit event. So this quilt definitely got exposure, but really the first time we really got exposure in like the sewing world was when it premiered at QuiltCon, like 2018. And that was really one of the first big, PIQF, there's been, but post SJSA being created, has this quilt been in quilt world? Because, after like 5 rejections, I'm like, it's okay. It doesn't seem like the quilt world, in 2012 was very receptive to it. So I stopped asking. It's like, no one wants to give you a seat at the table, go build your own. I left.
So what was some of the feedback that you got about the quilt at QuiltCon?
At QuiltCon, MQG people are, I'd say, hands down, some of the biggest supporters of SJSA, supporters in terms of embroidery, in terms of donating fabric. MQG has definitely curated this intentional group of like, quilters that care about amplifying other people's, voices. And I definitely give a lot of shout outs to MQG. But I'd really say, for being like a 16, 17-year-old who'd never made an art quilt, like some critique in terms of the construction. I got this, like I quilted it myself. Typically I would send my stuff to a long arm. So if you look at it, like there's definitely a lot of puckers and whatnot because I did it on a machine, like an 8-inch throat. But other than that, I think for me, it wasn't about the perfection of the quilt as much as just look at what it's about and then let's talk about it. The quilt was made with the intent to be a conversation piece. And I think, as Sean Kimber shared, far more eloquently than I ever could, but really like a quilt is supposed to be something that many people associate to being cuddly and something you want to wrap yourself in. When you see a quilt, something that babies are like swaddled in, and they're gifts and like they're warming gifts. Like if you lose your house in a fire, get a quilt. If you have a new baby, get a quilt. Like quilts are definitely very welcoming. Like to have the juxtaposition of having a murdered boy's face on something that's supposed to typically greet people with comfort. I definitely have gotten some like, oh, he was a thug, he should have listened. I'm like, you might be confusing this case, but Trayvon wasn't doing anything. So I definitely well, that's why Zimmerman wasn't guilty. And it's like, what do you say to that? Like, there's definitely been in Florida. We were at a World Quilt show that Mancuso put on, like World Quilt Florida. There was a lot of people who really, they didn't like this quilt, but they didn't like the entire exhibition either. So you can't win and please everyone. But for the most part, I'd say people are interested in kind of like the catalyst for me personally on what kind of transitioned me from quilting, with the intent of teaching kids how to sew, with the intent of creating to, have a message be heard.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good segue to tell us about the Social Justice Sewing Academy and how did it come about?
So SJSA was created as soon as I graduated from UC Berkeley, I created a summer program where kids could just create what they cared about. The way that Trayvon hit me, I realized there's a quote from Arundhati Roy that says, "There's no such thing as the voiceless, only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." And so for me, as I had done 100+ hours in Title I, schools near UC Berkeley, I realized how many kids had a voice that was being deliberately silenced, whether that was in their home life, whether that was by their school administration, or whether that was, just by adults in general. I feel like oftentimes, most adults aren't listening to kids as opposed to like wanting to teach them. An example being, like we were having a conversation with a few kids in Instagram chats yesterday, or on Christopher Columbus Day, but they're like, "Sarah, we all know what 3 ships Christopher Columbus, sailed in on, but we don't even know the indigenous land, as you guys just honored, that our schools are built on." like schools, definitely have, an intentional like bias and viewpoint and perspective that they teach from. So when kids are feeling like, a viewpoint they might want to listen to isn't being taught, or a viewpoint that they care about, isn't being honored or valued, that definitely can lead to, them feeling like no one's listening to things that, we care about. And as we know, the schools, like, they have set curriculum. So sometimes, the school has to do what, like, there's so many layers to it. But I think with SJSA, it was really about providing a space for them to dictate what do they want to learn about, what do they want to create art about, what do they want to speak about, how do they want their voices heard through art.
Mm-hmm. And do you go to the school, or does the school kids come to you?
School kids invite us there. So typically me, and we have a team of facilitators, a lot of young people that are like still 19, 20, who've just been in SJSA workshops. We definitely like to empower and have this like autonomous circle of like young people go through the workshop. They can become facilitators. They can go teach the workshops, et cetera, et cetera. But definitely kind of like, giving young people an opportunity to do something, whether that's teaching art, whether that's leading an action project, whether that's doing an action project. There's definitely a lot of components to SJSA, besides the beautiful art that we create, in collaboration with this broader, SJSA community.
Mm-hmm. There's so many issues going on in the United States, around the globe, and we hear about them every single day from the morning to the night. How do you help the students figure out what they're going to focus on? You just said that you wanted their work to be relevant to them. You don't want to dictate something. You want them to, bring about their own voice and their perspective to their project. But how do you facilitate that? That's a tough one. It's sort of an overload for all of us.
No, I'd say honestly though, when you ask them like, hey, if you could fix one issue in your community, like we all know that there's lots, but what would be the first? And I think what disproportionately impacts them the most is what typically they go to, whether that, being gentrification, whether that to be redlining, school inequalities, school funding, or even food deserts. Like we've had kids create art on, for everything ranging from, my grandma is all diabetic and like, my grandfather is like 400 pounds because we have no good food. Like there's so many things that like really when you break it down to like what disproportionately impacts them, ranging from gun violence to gang, to underserved communities, to police brutality, like definitely kids focus on, what hits them the most. And so when you kind of have that discussion and give them, a space to have the microphone, their communities, like definitely there's common themes that arise. Like I can definitely recall going to Chicago, like a few major themes that arise with gun control, police brutality, in prison, whether that's school to prison pipeline and just prison in general. The amount of those kids that had been to a funeral was like alarming. I mean, like they were middle school kids. When 80% of the class raised their hand, they've been to over 3 funerals. It's definitely, it hits differently. And I think, for them, that's their lived reality. So when they create art, definitely the intersection of a lot of the systemic things that are impacting them definitely rise to the surface.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What do you want the students to take away from the program?
I would say you don't have to be an adult to get started doing anything. I'd say like you can, like being an activist, like we definitely, do youth profiles. We talk about, kids. And I think, oftentimes, the conversations with Sarah, like we're not white and like kids of color that have been doing this work, and it's like, you don't have to be like, you can get started, whether you're doing an action project, kind of even having the conversation on like media recognition isn't what activism is about. It's like, you can be doing activism in your own communities, whether that's Sean King type activism where you're following and calling and doing stuff, whether that's you mobilizing your friends to have a clean day at the park. It's all your community. It's definitely kind of like there's no age of like being old enough to get started. So I really think kind of the action piece of like, you've made this art, it's going to be in quilt shows, let's have your voice heard, let's have you come speak, but really kind of the motivation to get them to get like that spark. As Tupac said, like he wouldn't change the world himself, but he might be able to spark the minds that could. So it's like for me, kids are all candles. Some have been lit earlier than others. Let's just kind of give them, whether that's tools they need or finances that SJSA could support them with, or even a mentor. Like all those things. Like let's figure out what do you need to be supported to be able to do something that you care about.
Right. You're a nonprofit organization, correct?
Correct.
So you now have the platform to ask for support and to in a lot of different ways. we all know that arts education and these kind of activities that you do within your organization are far and few within all of our schools, especially middle schools and high schools. You know, the little kids get more, but once you start getting into adolescence and the teen years, there seems like there's just not enough out there. What would you ask people to do to keep the kind of work that you do going and expanding and growing? What are your suggestions?
I would say I feel like I know so many artists. I would say like reach one, teach one. And I'd say like I think every artist that I know, I would encourage, who are you mentoring outside of your family? Because everyone teaches their grandkids how to sew. But like, what about the kids who don't necessarily have a grandma who is amazing enough to know how to sew? I definitely would say like, have you offered your local Boys and Girls Club? Have you reached out to your middle school and been like, hey, I have some extra sewing machines. I'd love to volunteer. I mean, there's, I think oftentimes like the way that, I've reached out to schools when I was at Harvard, like, hey, I have this program, I'd like to do this workshop. I reached out. I mean, a quick live scan and the schools will let you come do things, especially if you have a track record of knowing how to do things. So I think oftentimes just opening, your mouth and offering can make all the difference. And I think, when you get into these spaces, like kids have never done it. Sewing is something, most kids, like it's really definitely skipped a generation. Their grandma might know how to sew, but their moms don't, and they surely haven't. So I think when you and it's like even in the rhetoric on how you present it, like yeah, you're gonna sew or you're gonna be a textile artist. Like you're like there's so many ways that you can flip the rhetoric to make sure that everyone feels engaged and there's no and even have a discussion. Well, let's talk about sewing. Let's talk about the gendered connotations that you guys are bringing to the surface. Why do you think sewing is a grandma sport? Let's Google the most famous fashion designers. Let's talk about young people that run that. Have you guys seen Project Runway? Like there's so many videos that you can do to kind of explore. And it's like sometimes when they think sewing, they think quilting. Well, what about car upholstery? What about like curtains? What about drapery? What about like there's so many avenues that some kids might not know that sewing is not one monolithic experience. It's not just quilting. It's not just garment design. Sewing is it's just like painting. You can paint a mural or you can paint a canvas. There's lots of options. So really expanding their mind to what sewing can be more than just putting on a button or hemming pants, which oftentimes kids will say that's what sewing is. I'm like, yeah, that's tailoring, but you're getting close.
Yeah. Wow. I like that. So you also, besides running this organization and doing this great work, you're also working another job. Is that correct?
I have a full-time job working in custody in California in local jails. So I work in jails and community like satellite campuses where inmates, so it's 18 and up, it's an adult alternative high school program where people go to jail and they get enrolled and whether they're serving 30 days or 90 days or they're in jail till their trial or they're in jail because they can't make bail. Unfortunately, our system is a mess. But once they get out, we have continuous satellite campuses. But really, I'm like in a high school, like site director of running and helping people get their diploma.
Oh, and so how do you weave in influencing self-expression through the arts with the young people that you're working with?
So I've definitely done workshops. It's just like, the type of scissors we can bring in and counting fabric and stuff is definitely, not necessarily the freeing space that I, like SJSA to be. In fact, like even the conversations can be censored. Like there's microphones in jail. You can't have a SJSA workshop on, mass incarceration in jail. Like they pull me. Like there's so many censorships that jail, yields that, I'd even reflect and say oftentimes mirror the quilt world in terms of, the conversations that, quilting organizations want to have or not have or turn off Instagram comments for. There's definitely, censorship in all aspects, but I'd say like in terms of creativity, I definitely try to bring in arts through all this, dominant high school areas that we do. So when we have math, I like to bring in lessons on like doing tax returns, and when we have science, like there's very few hands-on things we can bring, but really kind of relating it to things of like, hey, you guys have kids. When you guys get out of here, you need to be able to know, like what two colors make green. Like these are just some common sense things, as parents, you guys should know. So really kind of rooting it like, yeah, you might be 42 and still working on your diploma, but like this is going to matter. And it's not just a piece of paper. It can be, the next step to a lot of things. So just kind of keeping education as like a liberatory tool of empowerment is kind of the way that I like to go with it. And of course, for English classes, like I like to bring in printed in like important things, whether that's current events, news, because they don't have access to news, which is another form of It's just California jail. Woo. But bringing in news and like, let's talk about biases. Like I'll bring in, newspapers from the far right, from the far left, and let's have conversations on, what's the truth and how do you determine the truth through all this? And, like highlight a sentence that shows the author's bias. How did you know that was his bias? What words did he use? Like really kind of talking about the context. I think oftentimes you can teach, like I'm not teaching so people can like regurgitate or answer, the questions that I want them to know. But I really want them to get a lens on how they can move forward viewing the world beyond them getting or finishing this high school diploma program or not.
Oh, that's great. That's inspiring. Wow. So you've accomplished so much over the years. You are an amazing role model for young people. Um, are there any new dream projects that you have in your mind, in your heart, that you'd like to do in the next couple of years?
I'd like to develop SJSA curriculum to a point where schools could accommodate it without necessarily needing the small 100% volunteer run staff that we have. So whether that's like Zoom trainings or even like an arts educator conference, where we could have like a bunch of arts educators from all over like the US come, like the National Arts Education Conference. We had been selected, which is like a really big deal in Chicago this year to present. And then COVID hit. And so like that was definitely an opportunity I was really looking forward to, just because I think this art doesn't need to, or this process doesn't need to solely be done by me or the few volunteers we have. If like the teacher can get rooted and like the pedagogy and the model of like how this is run and like the way conversations are set up, it's definitely like it can yield itself to really positive results. But COVID definitely has put a loop in things. But I'd say since COVID, we've started a business incubator program. We're working with over 50 kids, giving them each $1,000 to develop their own creative idea. In the same way that sewing with my entrepreneurial thing as a 12-year-old, other kids want to do everything ranging from embroidery, social justice quotes to screen printing to candle making. Like kids have all these ideas on what they want to do to change the world. And like the business aspect is one side, but it's going to obviously yield to like being able to do more for their greater community. And so as that program, it started like September like 8th. But like it's been 2 months, but we've got these kids, we've got this amazing cohort of volunteers, again, speaking to so much talent that's in the sewing world. We've got business CEOs and camp executive directors, and we've got just curators, and we've got amazing adults that are volunteering their time with kids who really never have an adult even spending that much time to listen to them, especially the adults of caliber that we have these mentors, from. So I think really oftentimes it's just having, a facility or an organization, do this pairing and just be like the median of connecting kids who need, mentorship with amazing and dedicated mentors, all virtually, of course.
Mm-hmm. So going back to when you were at Harvard, did you have any idea what you'd be doing today?
No, I definitely was. This is a fun passion project, and I think the more like the demand came for it, the more I realized like I needed to take this seriously. I needed to get a 501(c)(3) so we could get donations. I needed to, kind of do that support. But I think for me, it's all been like if young people want to be able to create and they can't afford it, they shouldn't be like, oh, sewing's not for you because you can't afford it. It's like we need to be able to make this accessible. We need to be able to, make this affordable and equitable. I think the amount of kids that I've seen the potential to become the next Bisa Butler, for those who are like in the art quilt world, like Bisa is like my quilt Beyonce. It's like there's so many kids that like you have a style. Like if Bisa was your mentor, imagine where you'd be. Like you'd be like quilt Picasso, but like you don't have a mentor, and unfortunately you're in a foster group home and you've got a terrible life deck of cards that you've been handed. So what can we do as an organization to help pair you with resources, even just the materials alone for you to just create, whether you finish it or not. Here's the opportunity to create. Here's some blank canvases, here's some fabric, here's some et cetera, et cetera. We'll get it embroidered. We can finish the quilt. Just create the art component. Here's a sewing machine. Like I think those type of things are just giving kids the tools, whether they run far with it or don't. They still were given the opportunity.
Do you look for donations of equipment, like you're saying, like sewing machines and material and things like that?
And people do. People definitely do donate, and we definitely give them right back out. So I'll always, like it's like an open door of like donations are always welcome because there's so many kids that will go through just a workshop, and a workshop can be with like 100+ kids at a time. If 11 kids from the workshop all ask for materials, that's 11 machines, 11 rotaries, 11 mats, 11, whether we have to buy it because we don't have it or whether, if someone has, donated it, we definitely make sure that we equip these kids with the tools for them to do more than just one workshop if they so have that desire.
Wow, that's great. So, in terms of expansion, you're now going from school to school or community to community. Do you see yourself being able to expand over the next couple of years? Or, I mean, this is a crazy time. It's almost a crazy question to ask during this pandemic, but virtual is working somewhat for some people. So,
No,
um,
I think Zoom fatigue is definitely, wearing, but I think, Instagram group chats and text group chats that we have, I think kids are still like, I want to do something. And it's like, I think right now, COVID, if anything, has highlighted some of the inequities that, we might have been overlooking. Um, so I think, kind of moving forward, I think I'd love to get like organizational, like grant support. So like we can have full-time young people hired, we can have part-time hired. There's a few volunteers that like I'd love to have hired, for part-time because there's so much, regard fielding requests or kind of setting up stuff. There's definitely, the demand. It's just, there's only so much we can do after work hours as a volunteer run organization. But I definitely think, post COVID, when things do settle down, I hope that schools, can shift, to a more accepting of not just for the enhancement and the increasement and the
mhm,
encouragement of the arts, but really, with the purpose of like spurring kids into action and empowered them to be, young agents of social change. I think,
right,
when kids are given the opportunity to do something, they have stuff they want to do. It's just no one's asking them, what do you want to do?
right. Why don't we do this? Well, I'd like to move, if this is okay with you, to look at some of the quilts in the exhibition, and perhaps you could tell some stories or tell us a little bit. I know that we have some actual recordings of the artist for the exhibition. So, Lindsay, can you set us up there?
Something amazing that I love that you guys have done is like traditional quilt exhibition will mount the quilts on a wall or like on like a canvas because that's how
Right.
it's done. And the fact that you guys have them like free hanging in the air means you can see all the embroidery and all the long arming from both sides. So I definitely think like that's a genius, I props off for you guys in terms of the space, the aesthetic layout. It's a really beautiful, beautiful exhibition. And for those, I'll definitely be there the weekend of the opening. So I'm really excited to go, see
Gr-
it.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to our prep team that they do a great job in designing and installing. So this quilt here, this is one of the first ones I saw when I was looking at the work, and it's beautifully made and so sad and impactful. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so this quote was made by Audrey. Audrey's definitely one of those kids that I could think could be the next Lisa Butler. She lives in Baltimore, and she created this quote after there was another school shooting. It was like a few weeks before we had the workshop. She's like, I want to make a quilt on school shootings, but instead of kind of focusing on the guns and the typical images that kids go to, she's like, I want to talk about like the loss of potential. And I think what's been interesting is like this quote was hanging in an exhibit, and someone said, "Oh, he's sleeping under a tree." I remember looking at her like, "You definitely didn't. You missed the mark." But I think for her, what was striking to me is like one, the size of an AR-15 exit wound is the size of an orange. So that was like the literal inspiration. So she cut a bunch of oranges. She measured the radius, and like those are life size examples of oranges. But you can't really see just because she intentionally used colors that blend in. In each of the oranges are words that how she feels uphold these structures that kind of lead to gun control, ranging from AR-15s to toxic masculinity to NRA. Like there's all these words that are in the oranges, and I think like the fruit of kind of like that's having this tree that is killing a lot of young people. The graduation gown, obviously the lost potential. He hadn't even made it yet, or even if he was a young graduate. I think the way that Audrey's able to use such busy prints to be something as simple as like a silhouetted face is phenomenal. And I think that her color, and again, this is the second quilt thing she's ever made. So it's like this, she's not an artist. She literally works at a fast food restaurant. She's got this eye for like design and perspective, and like the way that she freehand drew this kid slumped under a tree is just, I mean, it's pretty phenomenal. And I think, for her artist statement, for those, want to take the time to really, go listen to the QR codes and take a minute and read it. It's like, like kids are the ones that are feeling this fear. Kids are the ones that are feeling like the lack of urgency that, parents and adults are giving this. It's like right now, who's who's in school, kids, and who's making the rules for like what's going to happen in schools. People who aren't even in schools, politicians and lawmakers, and the policy people that are making the rules aren't the ones that are going to school. So it's like rules that are like about school. Who should be making those rules? I mean, as they would argue, the kids that go to school should make the rules about what's going to happen in school. Flipping that agency and flipping that dichotomy on who gets to control their educational environment. Are common themes that kids, their frustration, and their disengagement. Like who gets to pick the curriculum they get to learn? Not them. So it's like it's oftentimes you look, and it's particularly kids in SJSA workshops, from this deficit model, like, oh, they're not listening, or oh, they have ADHD, and you're not teaching them what they want to learn right now.
Very true. Very true. Could we go to the next image, please?
This is Brian. So Brian made this quilt, Blood, White, and Blue. And Brian's inspiration was really his growing up in Oakland. Brian is an amazing, but 250-pound, 17-year-old Black boy that's like a good 6 feet. And so for him, his size alone, he's like, Sarah, people are so scared of me. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about, Brian? He's like, Sarah, he can be walking on the side of the street, and women particularly will cross the street. People will lock their car doors when he walks by. And he's like, Sarah, if they just would say hi, and I'm just like, Brian, he's really like a cuddly kid. I don't cuddle him, but Brian just like a really sweet kid. And so for him, the sheer size of intimidation that Black men, particularly teens, fear, it's I think for him, the adultification, and he didn't necessarily have the rhetoric, but for him, he's like, Sarah, he went from being like a kid to being a grown man overnight. The second he reached that 6-foot height, the way that people interacted with him, particularly, women, has really changed. And so for him, it's I think his frustration with, just being in Oakland. And so right now he's a sophomore at UC Davis. I'm really proud of him. Yeah. And so I think his quilt is kind of highlighting him, although he's breaking these systems and rising above, his family and ancestors. Brian's had an older brother who's been shot by gun violence, had a lot of cousins that have been in jail. And Brian's definitely coming from that quote unquote typical Oakland, Black male experience. And so for him, this quote was really about this is America. This is systemic. This is, this is my past. This is my, and although I'm not part of it, I'm still associated and I'm still correlated. And the ramifications of stereotype threat hold so true for him.
Wow. Again, a success in terms of he's on his way, he's at Davis, but the idea, the thought that his experience is within the community in Oakland and people fearing this young man should not be. It's very sad, very sad. Okay, the ABC quilts.
This is Bianca. So I had a workshop in Cambridge with over 100 kids, and Bianca was one of the kids that I want my own sewing machine. I want to make more blocks. I want it. And I was like, all right, girl, you can have it. You guys all can have it. If you want it, you can have it. So we connected with a bunch of kids. We have a bunch of kids' blocks. And so this is, again, I had one workshop with her. I gave her a bunch of blocks, and she created these 27 blocks in conjunction with a lot of text design, but really 100% on her own. She created them, from the confines of, her room that she shared with 3 girls. She's living in an adult, it was an adult run group home. So she had 11 girls that she lived with in Boston, and this was her interpretation of some of the most important social justice issues or people that she cared about. And so for Bianca, her artist statements were she wanted to do R for racism. And then the more we had conversations, I'm like, well, what is racism going to look like? She's like, well, what if I do, the water fountain? And I'm like, okay, is that going to show racism, or is that going to show people can't use a water fountain? She's like, well, the rooted issue. And so through that, she made a lot of design choices. She went R with Rosa Parks instead. There's definitely a lot of issues that, she cared about. She herself couldn't visualize into one concise image. And there were some greater concepts like P for white privilege that she was I need to do this. I want it to be on this. So I was like, well, what's going to show, white privilege without words? And she's like, well, silhouette, and this silhouette is better than the other silhouettes. And I said, okay, go for it. No one's telling you yes or no. So really the freedom that she was able to have, and the amazing community of embroidery volunteers that, worked behind her to really amplify and enhance her designs. This is definitely a phenomenal piece.
So we have this great artwork by young artists hanging in our museum. What can we do? What do you suggest for us to do to show the impact of their work, to show appreciation for their artistry, and also putting themselves out there? What do you recommend? I'm sitting here wanting to engage with each one of these artists.
I would say repost it, tag SJSA, because we DM them. I'd say like to have, you know, someone post their art on their own social media, write a blog post, you know, anything, quote their words. I think because so many of the kids are active on Instagram, and you know, when we're tagged, we can obviously, like, we have all their Instagrams, we just DM like someone, you know, obviously you've got to not be private, but you know, if you are public, you know, like I think really reposting is definitely in 2020 one of the biggest forms of affirmation. Like, I see you, I hear you, your art matters. You know, what you said matters. Or even, you know, your own feedback. Like, I saw these kids' art. These are some of the most phenomenal pieces to me. Like being included in, you know, like it's like for these kids, like they're not, they wouldn't even consider themselves artists. So to have someone repost their art is like the biggest, you know, like virtual snapping or just affirmation that, you know, you can really give a young person.
That's great. Okay, thank you. Great suggestion. Thank you. Okay, we have some more images.
Yeah, Audrey, this was made like last summer. So this is a phenomenal, you know, piece of art. And again, she was inspired by, you know, all these kids in cages. And I think, you know, from what she was hearing in Texas, and I mean, even with the recent allegations and you know, of like uteruses being taken, like there's so much happening in detention camps. And I think for a lot of the kids, the fact that they're kids, like, we've got to come up with a better solution. It can't be kids in cages. It can't be kids away from their parents. It can't be, you know, like I think right now millennials and Gen Zers, we have so much empathy intrinsically in us as a culture and as a generation. Like, this stuff we're not for. We're not, you know, we're not going to stand for it. And like, we're very much, you know, for the most part, I'd say pretty opposed. Like, you know, some of the decisions that our administration has been making in the past.
Mm-hmm. The other day I was at our museum, I was outside and I saw some people looking at this and talking about it. And their voices started getting louder and they were talking about how wrong this is, you know, and this is wrong. No, this can't be happening. They walked away pretty upset because of the topic of the conversation. I just heard a recording, sorry. Lindsay?
Yeah, did you want to play the recording for this one?
Sure, that sounds great.
Sorry, just a minute.
The racial profiling of those of Latin descent has grown with significant intensity. SB 1070, a legislative bill that originated out of Arizona, gave law enforcement the power to stop anyone whose appearance indicated they might be from a different country. They were then allowed to ask for proof of citizenship, and any individual over 18 who could not provide this was charged with a misdemeanor. This systematic targeting had serious repercussions, leading individuals who had committed no other crime to be deported, and those here legally in jeopardy of losing their immigration status over a failure to carry a document. Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled that the racial profiling aspect of this bill was unconstitutional, but upheld the right for law enforcement to demand proof of citizenship and detain an individual if it was not provided. Like all systems of oppression, the detainment of immigrants would not be hindered and has grown into border patrol stops that have allowed for stops of any desired person within 100 miles of a border and ask for proof of citizenships. The ACLU estimates 2/3 of all people live within this region and are subject to this allowed abuse of our Fourth Amendment constitutional right against search and seizures. In recent years, America has begun to specifically target and detain immigrants, specifically of Latinx origin, through ICE raids. With the aid of many local law enforcement agencies, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Team, otherwise known as ICE, have begun to attack known work sites, school drop-offs, and designated safe havens, driving suspected immigrants away to camps that are overcrowded and lack basic care and necessities. Families are impacted when children are separated from their families days, either in detention or by being greeted by an empty home upon arriving from school. Young children are kept in cages in these camps until they are given immigration hearings for which they must face without guardianship or legal aid. One of the largest private prison companies, CCA, had acquired the contracts to maintain and continue to build immigration camps. This is the corporation that has occupancy clauses for its prison, in which the government is required to pay substantial fines if there are not enough people locked up. Each individual who is detained is a dollar sign for legislation and for this corporation. The prolonged detention of immigrants, like all acts of oppression, has created a cycle of wealth and influence for those involved in its creation and implementation.
Wow. Amazing statement and passion. And wow. So is she continuing on with quilting and activism, I hope? And
She definitely is. I think far more on the activism side. She definitely, kind of enjoys, like most kids do, like enjoys the creation, in coalition and in collaboration with others. But because she lives in Baltimore, obviously, like, most of us are kind of in the Bay Area, definitely kind of, we've had a yearly contract with the school. It's called Polytechnic High School, where she goes in Baltimore. But really, each year we have at least a workshop there with one of our amazing volunteers named Belinda, who kind of has connected with the art teacher and really kind of giving all kids there that opportunity to create blocks, and for those who really enjoy the process to obviously have the opportunity to do more.
Okay. I think we have another image or two.
Kayla's quote. So this Jay-Z made a documentary that's on Netflix that kind of really recaps the story of Khalif Browder. And in short, he was 16 years old when he was, given 3 years in Rikers over a stolen backpack that, he eventually the charges were dropped. But he could have been out, like the first month of his 3 years, but he couldn't afford bail, nor could his family. So to send a kid this young to such a corrupt and abusive, and he like the stories that he shared, as he got out, it was like it's just not a place for kids. And so the way that this teen, particularly similar to Brian, although he's 16, he's a black 16-year-old. So what does that equal? In society's eyes, a male. Send him to adult. Giving this kid to Rikers basically when he got out of jail, he killed himself. And so I think what this quote, like, I think the collaboration between the embroidery volunteer, if you look on the right side, underneath his face, there's a lot of what looks like tally marks. There's tally marks for the amount of days he was in Rikers in general, the amount of days he was in solitary confinement, and then the amount of suicide attempts. And so so you can see that these are the days he was in Rikers. This day he did a suicide attempt. These more days. This day he did a suicide attempt. Those were the days he was in solitary. Those are the days he was in gin pop. And this final tally was his his suicide attempt. And so the days are those are the literal days. And if you really look, there's a lot of tallied marked days that go in. But I think to show that he's 16, that's a lot of it's just a lot of time. And for those who aren't familiar with the horrors, I definitely would encourage you to watch 13th, the documentary, to watch, the Khalif Browder story, and his family. He still didn't get justice for, and the jail didn't necessarily end with his death, but the mental torment and anguish, and, obviously the trauma that he endured physically, mentally, but also even sexually. If you really watch the documentary, it just ended in him taking his life. And so, like even in jail, like sometimes people end up in jail and they're like my students for 3 or 4 months, and although jail didn't kill them, by the time they get out, like they've lost their apartment, their car, their job, they have an eviction on their record now, and it really can be the catalyst for a domino of effects that's gonna ultimately end up, if not single-handedly, just over like universally ruining life. So I think, Kayla made this quote because she herself had a lot of family members that had been in and out of jail, and Khalif Browder's story, particularly due to her age, Khalif Browder resonated with her because she was also 16 when she made this quote. So it's to have, one of your peers, solitary confinement is oh, we could go into all the conversations on how unjust, our quote unquote justice system is. It should really just be the legal system. But, for the most part, kids have so much to say and so much that they're passionate about. And, a documentary can inspire a quote, just like, a book that they're reading can. So to be able to make art on what they care about, it's a pretty powerful, space of collaboration to be in and really watch kids just create.
Mm-hmm. Do we have the actual quote soundbite for the quote for this? Yeah.
Great. I created this quilt to remind people that the prison system is a continuation of slavery. Did you know there are more African Americans in the criminal justice system today than the number enslaved in 1850? When the 13th Amendment was passed, most people believed that slavery was over. However, there is a small clause in there that hides an exception. The amendment actually reads that slavery shall no longer exist in the United States except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. America has boldly exploited that cause to great profit since then. A young teenager in New York City named Khalids Story was locked up for nearly 3 years over a crime he didn't commit. This quote is to remind America that we haven't forgotten about Khalids Story, and there are likely thousands of other Browders still trapped in our other systems as well.
Okay. Lindsay, do we have any additional images?
We do, and just want to remind everyone you can put your questions in the Q&A and we can stop at any point now and address any questions. I did have one question about how people can donate. So I just put the link to your website in there, Sarah, but if there's any other information, just let us know.
Yeah, monetarily, and then we have a PO box. You can always ship fabric. In-kind donations are definitely appreciated as well.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Okay. Sarah, could you talk a little bit about this artist?
Yeah, this was made in one of our initial summer programs where, before I started Harvard. So this was a girl who made the quilt, embroidered the quilt, and finished it, solely by herself, as opposed to some of our newer models. Kids really just design. We had 6 weeks together. So she did all of it from binding to quilting. And so for Laura, her grandfather in her, immigration story of, coming out, to America, particularly through California, was kind of the inspiration. So for her, it's like Si se puede. It's kind of like that juxtaposition on yes we can, but really, in her interpretation, it's like the American dream and so many things saying yes we can when there's so many systemic, barriers that are barring, certain groups of people. Just definitely makes it harder. But similar to Brian, she's going to be the first in her family to go to college. She's definitely, trying to be the one to break that cycle of everything from generational poverty to, everything. And so I think for a lot of these young people, like they are going to be the first, and they definitely feel not only that pressure, but they feel that sense of pride of knowing that, they're going to do it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's hear, I think we have a recording from her as well, right? Great.
My great-grandfather shared the stories of his tiempos, which means time, in the hot summer fields, and he reminded us of all the sacrifices he made for my grandparents. Inspired by his description of the uncomfortable work conditions, this quilt possessed the question whether or not America actually supported the Si se puede motto. This slogan means yes, we can, and typically is followed by an exclamation mark. However, I chose to use question marks because my grandfather worked hard never knowing what his blood, sweat, and tears would mount to. Soon, I will be the first in my family to go to college. I am a product of my great grandfather's work ethic, and his efforts are not taken for granted.
That's
sorry, we do have a couple questions. So
great. Thank you, Lindsay.
Let's see. So one question is, Sarah, are you familiar with G's Ben quilts from Alabama, and have they been an influence on you?
Yeah, I've seen them twice. They were in San Francisco and once in the Oakland Museum for the Arts. I definitely, I think the minimalist creation of such beauty through scraps and through, how those G's Bend artists, did in that town of like really no other influence has definitely, in terms of our longer term programs, we definitely show, like a scope on social justice quilts and quilts made by marginalized groups. We start with native quilts and we go into the history of weaving, and we definitely have a history of like understanding that like there's lots of different groups of people that have all kind of came to this similar art form through their own inspiration and their own conditions. So definitely I'm aware of them, and I definitely make sure that most kids leaving knowing about the AIDS quilt, knowing about Gee's Bend, knowing about lots of different type of historical significant contributing factors to the quilting community.
Thank you. And then another question is, can you talk about the impact that exhibiting these quilts has had on the artists that have participated in the program? And has having a space for exhibiting played a role in encouraging continued art production?
I would say absolutely. I think the kids, especially in this first, 6-week program, like, yeah, our art's never going to go anywhere. Like, these are our first quilts. Like, and I think for like kind of having that conversation, particularly with the kids, I'm like, no, like we've got an organization, we've got enough, like connections and network to be able to get this art seen. I think it's kind of leveraging the like dynamic on who's important enough to have an exhibition. Like most first time artists will never really get that opportunity, but in coalition, not only with the intergenerational collaboration between the kids and the embroidery volunteers, which obviously, definitely increase the skill and literal like detail condition, but I think kind of explaining that like it doesn't matter if you're a first time artist, your quilt will be seen, it will be exhibited, whether it's a quilt show or a museum. It's like at this point, the kids really believe in it. And I think our track record of being able to show exhibits, we've had an exhibit at UCR, we've had an exhibit at this Jewish Contemporary Museum in San Francisco, we've had an exhibit at a local library. It doesn't matter where it's going to go, it's going to be hung up, your name's going to be mounted, your artist statement might be able to be pre-recorded, as we can do now with QR codes. Really kind of encouraging them to see the end product definitely is like the inspiration, the encouragement in the beginning.
That's awesome. And have you can you talk a little bit about, my question is, can you talk a little bit about the volunteers? Like, we have so many embroidery volunteers and how they got involved, how they found out about it, and where they are. Are they local or are they spread out?
They're definitely pretty national. I'd say they're all across the U.S. We've got at this point over 5,000 who've signed up at least one time. I'd say most times they sign up and like it's not something they're going to do yearly, but like they at least have signed up once. And I think for them, the kids are traveling. So many kids have never really left their state or the area that they're from. So the fact that their quilt's gonna be mailed to Hawaii to be embroidered, I think that definitely increases the expansion. And I think as people get the kids art and they post, hey, I'm working on embroidering it, this is what the kid said, this is the kids art, obviously giving credit where it's due, but really honoring the collaboration that's going to happen. But really I think social media can often open doors for a lot of conversations to happen. Sheila, as you shared, like if you see the art, you can see the art on Instagram too, particularly in smaller bite-sized pieces. So when you look at a community quilt, you look at some of these kids' quilts, made by a kid, embroidered by a kid, pieced by a team of volunteers, embroidered by an adult, not a kid. But really, it takes a community, it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a community to really make these community quilts and have these kids' work go from like cut and glued textile art into like real quilts that will withstand folding and a lot of shipping.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So anyone who's an embroiderer out there and wants to get involved, they can just sign up with you, right?
On our website.
Okay.
And get involved.
Right. Unfortunately, we're getting toward the end of the hour. This is such a great conversation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can kind of close out.
Sara, thank you so much for allowing us to have this wonderful work, and thanks for participating in this conversation. And I hope we do more together in the future. Your organization is amazing. The stories are amazing, and we should get more sort of quilt making and fabric arts happening in the region. So
I'm excited for these kids to be able to work with the upcoming workshops, and I hope to have an exhibit next year with UCR kids, or just Riverside County kids, with their own art featured. I think bringing kids to an exhibition of work that they've made, hanging in it, is like a moment of empowerment that's pretty priceless. But thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate everyone's time, and thank you all for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm also really excited about the workshops. I can't wait for us to work with you on that and bringing those to schools. I've included a link to in the chat to our Culver 10th anniversary celebration, which is next week on October 24th. So anyone who wants to attend that, we hope you'll join us for that, as well as for our next Third Thursday talks, which is on November 19th. And we'll have a curator, and this is when we'll have a curator talk about the new exhibition, Lift Your Head, Bruce Davidson and the Evolution of Seeing, and talk about the work by photographer Bruce Davidson, which is currently on view, will be on view when we open in the California Museum of Photography. So you'll find those links to register in the chat. And Third Thursday talks are made possible with the generous support from the Marjorie and Glenn Thomas Memorial Fund. And it's also because of supporters like you that we're able to make Third Thursday talks and all of our virtual programs possible. So please consider making a donation if you're able to. And when you do, thank you. Again, thank you so much, Sarah. And we'll sign off.